Sometimes, the strongest people are those who rebuild their lives from the ashes of loss. When everyone expects you to fall apart, there's a quiet power in proving them wrong. In a Norse village, young widow Freya has held on to her farm when others lost everything. But her world changes when a giant warrior stumbles from the forest, bloodied and broken. This is Eirik, betrayed by his clan and now hunted. He drops to one knee before her and says, "Please take me as your worker, ma'am. I'm strong." What happens when two people who have lost everything find something worth protecting in each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like memories that refused to fade. Freya stood at her kitchen window, watching the sun paint the water in shades of amber and gold, the same colors that had filled her husband's eyes when he smiled. 3 winters had passed since Born's ship returned without him, since the village women had whispered their condolences. While calculating how long she might last alone, they had been wrong about many things. Her father's axe hung above the stone hearth, where it had rested for 40 years, first in his hands, then in Born's, and now by rights that no one dared question in hers. The weight of that inheritance pressed against her shoulders as she moved through her morning routine, checking the grain stores, counting the preserved fish, ensuring every corner of her domain remained under her control. The farmstead stretched across 20 acres of good coastal land, blessed with rich soil and protected harbors. Other widows had been forced to remarry within months of their loss, their property absorbed by ambitious neighbors or distant relatives who appeared with old debts and convenient claims. But Freya had prepared for such wolves long before they came circling. She had learned her father's lessons: well, trust your neighbors, but sleep with your axe close. When Harald the Elder had arrived with papers claiming Bjorn owed him half the farm, she had calmly produced her own documents, written in her late husband's hand, detailing Harald's debts to them. When young Olaf had suggested she needed a man's protection and offered his own services, she had demonstrated her archery skills on targets that bore a striking resemblance to his silhouette. The village had learned to respect her boundaries. Now, as she stepped outside to begin her daily tasks, Freya caught sight of her reflection in the well-still water. At 28, she remained what the village women called handsome, strong shoulders, clear blue eyes, and hair the color of winter, wheat that she kept braided practically down her back. But there was something harder in her features now, something that had calcified during those first terrible months alone. The chickens scattered as she entered their pen, their anxious clucking a familiar soundtrack to her thoughts. She had discovered that solitude, while lonely, offered certain freedoms. No one questioned her decisions or challenged her methods. No one criticized her choice to plant barley instead of wheat, or to trade with the Irish merchants rather than the Danish ones. Her success or failure belonged entirely to her. The sound of breaking branches from the forest edge interrupted her feeding routine. Freya's hand instinctively moved to the knife at her belt, her body tensing with the alertness that had kept her alive and prosperous. Through the morning gloom, she watched a figure emerge from the tree line, not walking but stumbling, as if each step required tremendous effort. Even hunched and wounded, the man's size was unmistakable. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. His dark hair hung in matted tangles around a face marked by exhaustion and pain, and his clothes, what remained of them, bore the stains of both blood and forest travel. But it was his eyes that caught her attention as he drew closer, pale blue, like winter ice, filled with a desperate intelligence that spoke of a man who had once commanded respect. He stopped at the edge of her property, swaying slightly, and seemed to gather himself for what came next. Then, to her complete astonishment, this giant of a man lowered himself to one knee in the mud of her dooryard. "Please take me as your worker, ma'am," he said, his voice hoarse but carefully respectful. "I'm strong." Freya studied him with the calculating gaze that had served her well in negotiations with merchants and would-be suitors alike. Everything about him suggested violence. The breadth of his shoulders, the scars visible on his forearms, the way he held himself despite his obvious exhaustion. Yet here he knelt, offering service instead of demanding shelter. "You're bleeding on my turnips," she observed, noting the dark stains spreading beneath him. "I can work through pain, ma'am." "I've done it before. What's your name?" "Eirik Ironhand." The name meant nothing to her, but something in his tone suggested it should. "Where do you come from, Eirik Ironhand?" His pause lasted long enough for a crow to call from the forest and receive an answer from its mate. Far enough away that it doesn't matter. Freya circled him slowly, taking inventory. His hands, despite their present condition, showed the calluses of someone familiar with both weapon and tool. His posture, even kneeling, suggested military training. But it was the careful way he avoided meeting her eyes directly that intrigued her most, not from shame or weakness, but from a learned deference. That seemed recently acquired. "I don't need charity cases," she said finally. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for work. Food and shelter in exchange for labor. I can repair what's broken, build what's needed, and defend what's yours." The last phrase hung in the air, between them like smoke from a dying fire. Defense, the one thing her independence couldn't fully provide. The vulnerability that kept her awake during storms when strange ships appeared on the horizon. "You have weapons?" "No, ma'am." "Fighting? Skills?" Another pause. "Yes, ma'am." "Enemies?" This time, his smile was bitter as old ale. "More than I can count. Honesty, at least." Freya appreciated that in a world where most men led with boasts and promises. She walked to her well, drew up a bucket of cold water, and set it before him. "Drink. Then we'll discuss terms." He drank like a man who hadn't seen clean water in days, careful not to waste a drop. When finished, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and waited. "I don't tolerate laziness, drunkenness, or unwanted attention from my workers," Freya began, her voice taking on the tone she used with merchants. "You'll sleep in the barn, eat what I provide, and work from dawn until I say you're finished. You'll address me as ma'am or mistress, and you'll remember that everything on this land belongs to me. Break anything valuable, and it comes out of your meals. Try to steal from me, and you'll leave missing something important." Eirik nodded, his understanding. "You'll repair the north fence, replace the rotted boards in the barn roof, and clear the drainage ditches before the autumn rains. After that, we'll see if you're worth keeping through winter." "Yes, ma'am. And Eirik?" She waited until he looked up. "Whatever brought you to my door bleeding and desperate, keep it there. I've worked too hard building this life to have someone else's troubles burn it down." Something flickered across his features. Gratitude, perhaps, or relief. "You won't regret this." "I'd better not." As she watched him struggle to his feet, Freya wondered if she was making the first truly foolish decision of her widowhood. But the practical part of her mind, the part that had kept her fed and sheltered through 3 hard winters, noted the way he favored his left side, the careful control he maintained over his movements despite obvious pain, and the respectful distance he maintained even while accepting her charity. Whatever else Eirik Ironhand might be, he was a man who understood boundaries. In Freya's carefully ordered world, that alone made him worth the risk. The first week tested them both in ways neither had anticipated. Eirik worked with the desperate intensity of a man trying to prove his worth before his strength gave out entirely. Before dawn, Freya would find him already at his tasks, using the early light to repair fence posts or clear drainage channels. His movements were careful and methodical, but she could see the pain he carried in the set of his shoulders, the way he paused between lifting heavy stones. She had expected complaints or requests for easier duties. Instead, he approached each task as if his life depended on its completion, which, she realized, it probably did. On the third morning, while bringing him water and bread, she discovered him examining the broken shield he thought she hadn't seen him retrieve from the forest. The wood was split down the center, and the iron boss bore markings she didn't recognize. But the craftsmanship spoke of wealth and status far above that of a common laborer. "Keeping secrets already?" she asked Dottie, Eirik, startled, then carefully set the shield aside. "Old habits, ma'am." Sometimes a man's past follows him whether he wants it to or not. What kind of past requires hiding broken shields in hay bales? For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he looked directly at her for the first time since his arrival, and she saw something in those pale eyes that made her step back. Not fear, but recognition of depths she hadn't expected. The kind that gets good people killed for showing mercy to the wrong man. That evening, as they shared their simple meal by the fire, Freya found herself studying her strange worker with new interest. He ate with the controlled hunger of someone who had learned not to waste food, and his table manners, despite his rough appearance, suggested an upbringing far different from what his current circumstances might indicate. "You're not a common farmhand," she said finally. "No, ma'am. Soldier? Was? For whom?" Eirik's jaw tightened. "Clan Bloodaxe. Until they decided my loyalty was worth less than political convenience." The name meant something. She had heard it in whispered conversations at market, always spoken with either fear or respect. Clan Bloodaxe controlled territories far to the north, and their warriors were known for both their skill and their ruthlessness. "What did you do to earn their displeasure?" "I trusted the wrong brother with the truth about the right one." Freya had grown up around men who spoke in riddles when shame or pain made direct words impossible. She recognized the pattern and chose not to press further, though she filed the information away for future consideration. The next morning brought visitors. Elder Gunnar arrived with 2 of the village council members, their faces bearing the careful neutrality that usually preceded unwelcome news. Freya met them at her door, wiping flour from her hands and preparing herself for whatever criticism they had come to deliver. "Freya Bjorn's daughter," Gunnar began, using her formal name as he always did when speaking officially. "We've come to discuss your new worker." "What about him?" "The man is unknown to us. He carries himself like a warrior, yet claims to be a simple laborer. These are dangerous times to invite strangers into our midst." Through the window, Freya could see Eirik, working on the barn roof, moving carefully but steadily along the damaged section. He was far enough away that their conversation wouldn't carry, but she noticed the way he positioned himself to keep the cottage in sight while maintaining the appearance of complete focus on his task. "He works hard and keeps to himself," she replied. "What more would you have me require?" Proof of his intentions, references from his previous employers, some assurance that he isn't a spy or an advance scout for raiders. Councilman Eirik, a thin man with nervous hands, leaned forward. "There are rumors of unrest in the northern territories. Clan wars, shifting alliances. A man like that could bring trouble we're not prepared to handle." Freya felt her patience wearing thin. "A man like what, Eirik?" "One who repairs my fences and asks for nothing but food and shelter. One who moves like he's killed before and might do so again," Gunnar said bluntly. The observation was accurate enough that Freya couldn't dismiss it entirely. She had noticed the same qualities, the way Eirik scanned his surroundings before beginning any task, how he positioned himself near tools that could serve as weapons, the unconscious grace with which he moved despite his injuries. "If you're so concerned about our safety," she said carefully, "perhaps you should be grateful that such a man has chosen to work rather than raid." "That assumes his choice is genuine," Eirik replied. "What do we know of his true purposes?" "What assurance?" Do we have that?" His words were cut short by a shout from the direction of the harbor. Through the morning air came the sound of horns, not the gentle call that announced friendly traders, but the harsh, urgent blast that meant danger. All four of them turned toward the sound, but it was Eirik who reached them first. He had dropped his tools and covered the distance from the barn to the cottage with surprising speed, his previous careful movements replaced by the fluid efficiency of a warrior responding to threat. "How many ships?" he asked Gunnar, his deference replaced by crisp authority. "2, maybe 3 from the sound. Colors?" "We haven't seen. Then we need to look." Eirik turned to Freya. "Ma'am, do you have weapons stored inside?" The shift in his demeanor was so complete that even Gunnar stepped back. This wasn't the respectful laborer who had knelt in her dooryard. This was someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions quickly and having them obeyed without question. "Some," Freya admitted. "Get them. If these are raiders, they'll target isolated farms first." He looked at the council members. "You know your people better than I do. Who can fight and who needs protecting?" Gunnar's eyes narrowed. "You seem remarkably well-informed about raiding tactics." "Because I've used them." Eirik's honesty was as sharp as a blade, which means I know how to counter them. "Now, do you want my help, or would you prefer to debate my qualifications while your neighbors burn?" The horns sounded again, closer now, and with them came the sound of shouting from the village. Freya made her decision. "Eirik, ride to the Olafsson farm and warn them. Gunnar, gather whoever can hold a weapon and meet us at the harbor road." She turned to Eirik. "What do you need?" "Anything with a sharp edge and someone who knows the local terrain." "You have both." As the others hurried away, Freya led Eirik inside and opened the chest where she kept Bjorn's weapons, a sword that had seen better days, a battle axe her father had carried, and several knives of varying quality. Eirik tested the balance of each with practiced efficiency before selecting the axe and 2 of the knives. "This will do," he said, then paused. "Ma'am, when this is over, if we're both still alive, you're going to have questions. I have them now, and I'll answer them. But right now, the most important thing you need to know is that I've never broken faith with anyone who showed me mercy." The words carried a weight that spoke of personal cost, of choices that had led him to her doorstep bloody and desperate. Freya found herself believing him, not because she was naive, but because something in his manner convinced her that this man understood the value of honor in a way that few did. "Then let's make sure we survive long enough for those answers," she said. They moved toward the harbor road together, and for the first time since Bjorn's death, Freya felt the strange comfort of having someone capable standing beside her in the face of danger. The raiders proved to be merchants after all, Danes with legal cargo and proper intentions, their horns blown in celebration rather than threat. But the false alarm had accomplished something unexpected. It had shown Freya exactly what kind of man she had taken into her service. In the aftermath, as the village settled back into its normal rhythms, she found herself watching Eirik with new awareness. The way he had assessed the situation, organized the response, and prepared for battle spoke of extensive military experience. More telling was how quickly he had returned to his respectful deference once the danger passed, as if he understood precisely when to lead and when to follow. Over the following weeks, as autumn settled over the fjord with its palette of gold and crimson, their daily routine found its rhythm. Eirik proved to be not just strong, but remarkably skilled with his hands. The fence he repaired was stronger than the original. The barn roof he patched would survive another decade of coastal storms, and the drainage system he improved would prevent the flooding that had plagued her fields for years. But it was the evenings that surprised her most. Freya had grown accustomed to spending her nights alone, working at her loom by firelight while the wind whistled through the gaps in the walls. The steady rhythm of weaving had become meditation. each thread carefully placed as she built something beautiful from individual strands, much like her own life. She sometimes thought, rebuilt one careful decision at a time. Now, with Eirik sleeping in the barn, she found herself setting aside her work earlier to share the evening meal. Their conversations began simply enough discussions of the next day's tasks, observations about the weather, practical matters that required no personal revelation. But gradually, like water finding its way through stone, something deeper began to emerge. "You learned to weave from your mother?" Eirik asked one evening, watching her hands move with practiced precision across the loom. "My grandmother. She said it taught patience and planning qualities every woman needed to survive." Freya paused in her work. "What did your family teach you?" "To fight, to lead, to trust the sword in my hand more than the word in another man's mouth. Useful lessons, given your circumstances." Eirik's smile was rueful, less useful than I once believed. "A sword can't protect you from betrayal by those you call brother." She wanted to ask more about the betrayal, about the family that had shaped him, about the path that had led him to her doorstep. But something in his posture suggested those wounds were still too fresh for direct examination. Instead, she asked, "Do you regret coming here?" "No, ma'am." "This is the first peace I've known in 2 years." The simple honesty of his answer touched something in her chest that she had kept carefully guarded since Bjorn's death. Freya returned her attention to the loom, but she was aware of Eirik's presence in a way that had nothing to do with caution. The turning point came on a gray morning when she discovered him in the barn, not sleeping as usual, but sitting upright against a hay bale, his face drawn with pain. The injuries he had carried to her farm had been healing, but something had reopened during the night. "Show me," she commanded, bringing water and clean cloth. "It's nothing I can't manage, ma'am." "Show me, or I'll assume you're too proud to accept help and find myself a worker who isn't." Reluctantly, Eirik pulled aside his shirt to reveal a long gash along his ribs, not fresh, but infected enough to cause fever. The wound had been stitched at some point, but the work was rough, clearly done without proper supplies or skill. Freya had tended injuries before, both for Bjorn and for various animals around the farm. She worked quietly, cleaning the wound and applying honey to fight the infection, aware of how Eirik held himself absolutely still under her touch. "This was made by a blade," she observed. "Yes, ma'am, recently, the night before I found you. Someone tried to kill you. Someone succeeded in killing the man I used to be." Freya paused in her ministrations. "What was his name?" "The man you used to be?" "Eirik Magnusson, second son of Clan Bloodaxe, war leader and oath brother to Jarl Thorvald." His voice carried the weight of titles that had once meant everything. "He died the night he learned that his trusted friends had been planning his death for months. And Eirik Ironhand was born?" Eirik Ironhand was what remained after the burning. She resumed her work, binding the wound with strips torn from her own chemise. The intimacy of the moment, her hands on his skin, his quiet trust in her care, created something fragile and dangerous between them. Why did they want you dead? Eirik was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I discovered that my brother Magnus and my oath brother Thorvald had been selling information to our enemies. Battle plans, troop movements, locations of undefended settlements. They were getting rich while good men died in ambush they had arranged." Freya's hand stilled. "You confronted them?" "I tried to give them a chance to confess, to make things right." He laughed bitterly. "I believed that honor mattered more than gold. That brotherhood meant sacrifice for the greater good." "What happened?" "They accused me of treason. Said I was the one feeding information to the enemy. Had witnesses prepared, evidence planted." His jaw tightened. "By the time I realized how thoroughly they had planned my destruction, half the clan was calling for my head. But you escaped. Barely. A few good men who knew me well helped me get away. They died for it. The pain in his voice had nothing to do with his physical wounds. I've been running ever since, trying to stay ahead of the bounty they placed on my head. Freya tied off the bandage and sat back on her heels. How much? Enough to make any man rich for life. And you came here to my farm, where that bounty might bring danger to me and my neighbors. Eirik's eyes met hers directly. Yes, I'm sorry for that. If you want me to leave, I didn't say that. Freya gathered her supplies, thinking, but I need to know, are they still hunting you? Magnus won't stop until I'm dead. He can't afford to let me live knowing what I know. Then, we'd better make sure you're worth the risk. That evening, their conversation took on new depth. Freed from the need to hide his past entirely, Eirik began to reveal glimpses of the man he had been educated, principled, accustomed to responsibility and respect. In return, Freya found herself sharing stories of her own struggles, the loneliness of widowhood, the constant battle to maintain her independence in a world that expected women to be protected rather than protecting. You could have remarried, Eirik observed as they sat by the fire. A woman of your capabilities would have had options. I had offers, Freya admitted, but they wanted my land more than they wanted me. And I've discovered that I prefer making decisions to having them made for me, even when those decisions are difficult, especially then. Eirik nodded as if her answer confirmed something he had suspected. My mother used to say that the hardest choices reveal who we truly are. What did your hardest choice reveal about you? That I value truth more than safety, even when that truth destroys everything I thought I knew about the people I loved. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending sparks up the chimney. Neither of them mentioned the growing warmth between them. The way their conversations had begun to stretch later into the evening, the careful distance they maintained that somehow felt more intimate than touch. But that night, as Freya lay in her bed listening to the storm, she found herself thinking not about the loneliness that had been her companion for 3 years, but about the steady presence sleeping in her barn. A presence that had brought not just strength to her farm, but something she had almost forgotten existed. The possibility of true companionship with someone who understood both sacrifice and honor. In the morning, she would return to the careful boundaries they had established. But for now, in the darkness, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to trust someone completely again. The village well had always served as more than a source of water. It was the heart of gossip, judgment, and social pressure that governed their small community. Freya had learned to time her visits carefully, avoiding the busiest hours when the other women gathered to dissect their neighbors' lives with the precision of skilled butchers. But avoiding gossip and escaping its effects were different matters entirely. Freya Bjorn's daughter called Astrid, the baker's wife, as Freya approached the well on a crisp morning in late autumn. We've been wondering about your new worker. 3. Other women clustered around Astrid like sheep seeking protection from wolves. Freya recognized the formation. It meant they had discussed her situation thoroughly and appointed Astrid as their spokesperson for whatever intervention they had planned. Wondering what, exactly. Freya lowered her bucket into the well with deliberate calm. Whether you think it wise, a young widow living alone with such a man. Such a man? Large, strong, unknown. Astrid's voice carried the tone women used when discussing dangerous animals. Solveig saw him working without a shirt yesterday. Said his back was covered in battle scars. Freya hauled up her bucket, considering her response. The truth that Eirik was a former war leader fleeing a price on his head would satisfy their curiosity while ensuring he'd be dead or gone by sunset. Lies would only fuel more speculation. That left deflection. His scars are his own business, as his work is mine. But the propriety of the arrangement is also my own business. Ingrid, The youngest of the group stepped forward with the boldness that sometimes accompanied inexperience. "People are talking, Freya, about what might be happening between you two. About whether it's appropriate for a woman in your position to what?" Freya's voice carried an edge that made Ingrid step back. "To run my own farm? To make my own decisions about whom I employ? To live my life without requiring permission from women who have never spent a night alone in their lives?" The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of water dripping from Freya's bucket. She had spoken more sharply than intended, but the constant scrutiny had worn away her patience like water wearing stone. Astrid recovered first. "We're concerned for your reputation, and for your safety. A man like that, with no family or references, works harder than any 3 men in this village. Asks for nothing beyond fair payment, and minds his own affairs better than some I could mention." With that, Freya turned and walked away, leaving the women to dissect her words and find whatever meaning suited their purposes. But she could feel their eyes following her, and she knew the conversation would spread through the village like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. The pressure intensified over the following days. Men who had previously ignored her began stopping by with offers of assistance, their timing coinciding with Eirik's absence from the farm. Elder Gunnar visited twice in 1 week, ostensibly to discuss village matters, but actually to observe her. Domestic arrangements with the critical eye of a man accustomed to having his opinions matter. Even worse were the subtle changes in how people treated Eirik himself. Merchants who had begun to nod in acknowledgement when he accompanied her to market now avoided eye contact. Children who had grown comfortable around his imposing presence began to whisper and point. The easy acceptance he had started to build dissolved under the weight of collective suspicion. Freya watched it happen with growing anger, not just at the unfairness, but at her own helplessness to prevent it. In defending him, she risked confirming their worst assumptions. In remaining silent, she left him to face their judgment alone. The breaking point came on an afternoon when she returned from checking her northern boundary to find Eirik sitting on a stump behind the barn, staring at something in his hands. As she drew closer, she realized it was a small knife, not one of his work tools, but something more personal, its handle carved with intricate designs. "Thinking of leaving?" she asked. He looked up, and she saw weariness in his eyes that went deeper than physical exhaustion. "Thinking of staying, and wondering if that's fair to you." "Why wouldn't it be?" "Because Magnus is coming." The words hit her like cold water. "How do you know?" Eirik held up the knife. "This was stuck in the barn door when I returned from the forest this morning. It belonged to Ragnar Scarface, one of Magnus's most trusted men. He always leaves it as a calling card before making a kill." Freya felt her world tilt slightly. How close? Close enough to scout this farm. Far enough away to make us wait and worry. Eirik's knuckles were white where he gripped the knife. "This is what I brought to your door, Freya. This is why I should have kept walking that first morning." She studied his face, noting the tension in his jaw, the way he held himself ready for violence even while sitting still. "But you didn't keep walking." "No." "Why?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was certain they should cross. When Eirik finally answered, his voice was quiet but steady. "Because for the first time in 2 years, I found someone who looked at me and saw something worth preserving." The honesty of it struck her silent. In the weeks since his arrival, she had grown accustomed to his presence in ways that went far beyond mere convenience. His quiet competence, his respectful manner, the way he anticipated her needs without overstepping her authority, all of it had woven itself into the fabric of her daily life until she could no longer imagine the farm without him. More than that, she had begun to look forward to their evening conversations, to the sound of his voice mixing with the crackle of the fire, to the comfortable silence that sometimes fell between them when words weren't necessary. She had started to think of him not as her worker, but as her partner in the endless task of survival. "The villagers think I've compromised myself by keeping you here," she said finally. "Have you? Not in the way they mean. In what way, then?" Freya sat down on another stump, facing him across the small distance that had come to represent all the careful boundaries they maintained. "I've grown comfortable with having someone I can trust completely. Someone who works beside me instead of trying to control me. Someone who—" She stopped, surprised by what she had been about to say. "Someone who what?" "Someone who makes me remember what it felt like to not be alone." The admission cost her more than she had expected. Since Bjorn's death, she had built her identity around independence, around needing no one. But the truth was more complicated. She had needed to prove she could survive alone. And now that she had, the solitude that had once felt like freedom was beginning to feel like exile. Eirik leaned forward, his pale eyes intense. "Then let me stay and face whatever comes. Not as your worker, but as someone who has found something worth fighting for. Even if it means bringing war to people who have shown you kindness, especially then. Because those people deserve to live without fear, and Magnus won't stop with killing me. He'll destroy anyone who helped me, anyone who might speak against him." Eirik's voice hardened. "I've been running for 2 years, trying to avoid exactly this confrontation. But running only delayed it, it didn't prevent it." Freya understood the mathematics of the situation. Whether Eirik stayed or left, Magnus would come. If he stayed, they could prepare. If he left, she would face Magnus's questions alone, with no protection and no ally who understood the enemy they faced. "What would you need?" she asked. "Time to prepare, knowledge of the terrain, and your trust that I can keep you safe. You have all three." That evening, their conversation took on new urgency as they discussed preparations and strategies. But beneath the practical planning, something else was shifting between them, an acknowledgement that they were choosing to face the future together, whatever that might bring. Dodd, as she watched Eirik sketch defensive positions on a piece of bark, his scarred hands moving with the confidence of someone who had planned many battles. Freya realized that somewhere in the space between employer and worker, between protection and trust, between survival and companionship, she had begun to fall in love. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like coming home. The Thornwood staff had belonged to Bjorn for as long as Freya could remember. Carved from a single piece of mountain ash and polished smooth by years of use, it bore the simple dignity of a tool made by someone who understood both wood and the hands that would grip it. After his death, she had kept it by the hearth, not quite ready to use it herself, but unable to put it away entirely. Now, watching Eirik work to reinforce their defenses, she found herself considering the staff's future with new eyes. "You favor your left side when you walk," she observed one morning as they surveyed his progress on the defensive. Earthworks.Eirik paused in his examination of sightlines and firing positions. "Old wound. It tightens up in cold weather. From the same fight that gave you the scar on your ribs? Earlier. Different battle, different enemy." He straightened carefully, demonstrating the limitation she had noticed. "Why do you ask?" Instead of answering directly, Freya walked to the cottage and returned with the Thornwood staff. She held it out to him, watching his face as he recognized what she was offering. "This was my husband's," she said simply. "Now it's yours." Eirik took the staff with the reverence due to such a gift, his hands finding the natural grip points as if they had been carved specifically for him. The weight and balance seemed to suit him, and when he took a few experimental steps, the improvement in his movement was immediate. "Are you certain?" he asked. Bjorn would have wanted it to serve someone who understood its value. The simple exchange carried layers of meaning that neither of them spoke aloud. by giving him her late husband's staff. Freya was acknowledging that Eirik had moved beyond the role of temporary worker. She was accepting him into her life in a way that went deeper than employment or even friendship. That afternoon brought visitors that tested this new understanding. Freya was checking the grain stores when she heard voices from the main yard, Eirik's, low and respectful, and another man's, louder and more aggressive. She moved to the window and felt her stomach tighten at what she saw. Thane Hakon stood in her dooryard, flanked by 2 armed men, and facing Eirik with the posture of someone accustomed to intimidating others into submission. Hakon controlled the largest farm in the region and had been among the most persistent in his suggestions that Freya needed masculine protection. "Cannot continue," Hakon was saying as she approached close enough to hear clearly. "A woman alone, harboring strange men, making decisions that affect the safety of our entire community." "The lady makes her own choices," Eirik replied, his voice carefully neutral despite the tension in his shoulders. "The lady makes foolish choices that endanger her neighbors." Hakon's gaze shifted to Freya as she emerged from the cottage. "Ah, Freya, we need to discuss your situation." "My situation is perfectly satisfactory, thank you." "Is it? When mysterious warriors appear at your door, when knives are found stuck in barn doors, when armed men scout our coastline looking for—" Hakon gestured dismissively at Eirik, whatever this one truly is. Freya felt the ground shift beneath her feet. 1 armed men. 3 ships, flying no colors we recognized, anchored in Seal Bay yesterday. The captains were asking questions about new arrivals, offering gold for information about a tall warrior. With pale eyes, Hakon's smile was unpleasant. "Imagine our surprise when we realized they were describing your worker." Eirik's knuckles were white on the thornwood staff, but his voice remained steady. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing, yet. But that courtesy has limits." Hakon stepped closer to Freya. "This is exactly the kind of trouble I warned you about. Your charity has brought danger to our shores. My charity has brought skilled labor to my farm and helped me maintain my independence," Freya replied, though her mind was racing. 3 ships meant Magnus had brought significant force to bear. The search was narrowing. "Independence?" Hakon laughed. "You call hiding behind another man's sword independence? At least be honest about what you're doing." The insult struck deeper than he might have intended, cutting straight to Freya's deepest fear, that in accepting Eirik's protection, she was surrendering the autonomy she had fought so hard to preserve. "I hide behind no one," she said quietly. "Then prove it. Send him away. Accept proper protection from men with legitimate claims to offer it." Hakon's meaning was clear. He was offering himself as a solution, complete with marriage and the absorption of her property into his holdings. "And if I refuse, then you force us to make difficult decisions about the safety of our community." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a poorly banked fire. Freya understood the implications: cooperation or exile, submission or isolation. The same choice that had been offered to countless women before her, wrapped in the language of protection and community good. "I need time to consider," she said finally. "Time is a luxury we may not have. Those ships could return at any moment." Hakon nodded to his men, then turned back to Freya. "I'll return tomorrow for your answer. I suggest you choose wisely." After they left, Freya and Eirik stood in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, and the peaceful farm that had become their shared refuge suddenly felt exposed and vulnerable. "You should go," Freya said finally. "Tonight, before they return." "No. Eirik, 3 ships. I know what 3 ships means. I also know what happens to people who help me after I disappear." He turned to face her fully. "Magnus doesn't leave. Loose ends. If I run now, he'll assume you know things that could threaten him. You'll die anyway, but you'll die alone. The brutal honesty of it struck her silent. She had been thinking tactically, trying to find a solution that preserved both. There lives. But Eirik was thinking strategically, considering not just immediate survival, but the longer game that Magnus was playing. Then what do you suggest? We make our stand here, together, on ground we know, with defenses we've prepared. Eirik gripped the thornwood staff. And we trust that 3 years of building your reputation for strength and independence wasn't wasted effort. You think the village will support us? I think some will. The question is whether some will be enough. That evening, they worked by lamplight to complete their preparations. The defensive positions Eirik had planned were simple but effective, using the natural terrain and existing structures to create overlapping fields of fire and multiple fallback positions. More importantly, they were designed to be operated by a small number of defenders against a larger attacking force. You've done this before, Freya observed, watching him sight along potential approach routes. Many times. Usually from the other side. Any regrets about that? Eirik was quiet for a long moment. I regret that it took losing everything to learn. The difference between conquering and protecting. As they shared their evening meal, the conversation turned to practical matter signal arrangements, weapon distribution, contingency plans if their primary defenses failed. But beneath the tactical discussion, Freya sensed something else, a deepening partnership that went beyond mere alliance. If we survive this, she said carefully, what happens then? Then we build something worth defending. Together? Eirik's pale eyes met hers across the firelight. If you'll have me, not as your worker, but as your partner in whatever comes next. The proposal, for that's what it was, despite the unconventional circumstances, hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Freya thought of all the conventional offers she had received and rejected, all the men who had wanted to absorb her strength into their own ambitions. This was different. Eirik wasn't offering to protect her. He was offering to stand beside her as an equal, to combine their strengths rather than subordinate one to the other. Yes, she said simply. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, dusting the ground with a thin layer of white that would show the tracks of anyone approaching their farm. Tomorrow would bring decisions that would determine not just their survival, but the shape of whatever life they might build together. Tonight, for the first time since Bjorn's death, Freya went to sleep feeling not alone, but partnered with someone who understood both the price of independence and the value of freely chosen commitment. The Council Stone had witnessed 1,000 village decisions over the generations marriages arranged, disputes settled, punishments decided, and judgments rendered. Now it bore witness to what might be the most consequential debate in the settlements. History. Elder Gunnar sat on the carved stone seat that marked his authority, while the other council members arranged themselves in the formal semicircle that tradition demanded. Freya stood in the center of their attention, aware that every word she spoke would be weighed not just for its immediate meaning, but for its implications for the entire community. Thanehaken had wasted no time in calling the gathering, arriving at dawn with his demand that the council address what he termed the threat in our midst. Now he stood at Gunnar's right hand, his presence a reminder of the economic and military power he wielded in their small world. The facts are simple, Hakon began, his voice carrying across the assembled villagers who had gathered to observe the proceedings. Freya Bjorn's daughter has harbored a fugitive whose presence has brought armed enemies to our shores. She has rejected reasonable offers of protection and instead chosen to endanger our entire community for the sake of one man's convenience. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some supportive, others skeptical. Freya recognized the faces of neighbors who had known her since childhood, people who had watched her transform from a grieving widow into a successful independent farmer. Their opinions would matter as much as the council's formal decision. Furthermore, Hakon continued, She has refused legitimate counsel from those charged with maintaining our collective safety. This stubbornness may cost lives." Gunnar raised his hand for silence. "Freya, my daughter, you may speak in your own defense." Freya had spent the night considering what she would say, weighing honesty against strategy, principle against pragmatism. In the end, she had decided to trust the same directness that had served her well in business dealings. "I am accused of harboring a fugitive," she began, her voice clear enough to carry to the back of the gathering. "This is true. Eirik came to my farm seeking work, and I gave it to him. He has repaid that opportunity with skill, loyalty, and honest labor. And what of the danger he brings?" Called out Eirik the Thin from his position among the council members. "Every choice carries risk. I chose to help a man in need, knowing that kindness sometimes comes at a cost. But I also chose to strengthen our community by keeping productive land under independent management rather than allowing it to be absorbed by those who already control too much." The command was a direct challenge to Hakon's designs on her property, and everyone present understood it as such. Hakon's face darkened, but he maintained his composure. "Pretty words," he said. "But what of the ships that scout our coastline? What of the armed men seeking your protégés? What assurance can you give that your personal choices won't lead to blood in our streets?" Freya had expected this question, but her answer still required careful delivery. "I can promise that if you force Eirik to leave, those same enemies will still come. Men like Magnus, for that is who hunts him, don't abandon grudges simply because their targets have moved. They come anyway, and when they find that their quarry has fled, they often take their disappointment out on those who might have helped him." "You know his pursuers?" Gunnar asked sharply. "I know their type. Warriors who use fear as a weapon, who believe that power gives them the right to take whatever they want." Freya paused, letting her gaze sweep across the assembled faces. "The choice before us isn't whether to face danger, but whether to face it united or divided." Young Bjorn Eriksson, barely old enough to sit with the council, but old enough to fight, leaned forward. "What would you have us do? We're farmers and fishermen, not warriors. Stand together. Prepare together. Trust that good people who know their ground can defend it against those who come as strangers seeking to take what isn't theirs. And if we refuse?" Hakon's question carried the weight of ultimatum. "Then you'll face the consequences alone when Magnus decides that a village that turns away fugitives might have other resources worth claiming." The truth of her words settled over the gathering like morning mist. Everyone present understood the mathematics of raiding. A successful attack on one target often led to investigation of others, especially when the raiders found a community unprepared to defend itself. Astrid, the baker's wife, spoke from the crowd of observers. "What does your man offer in exchange for our protection?" It was the first time anyone had referred to Eirik as her man, and Freya felt the weight of that designation. More than employment, more than alliance partnership that the community was beginning to recognize. Knowledge of how such men think and fight, skill in planning defenses, and a commitment to stand with us rather than simply being defended by us. "Pretty promises from someone who brought the danger in the first place," Hakon muttered. "No," said a new voice from the edge of the gathering. "Honest words from someone who's proven her worth." All heads turned to see old Magnus the fisherman though. Relation to Eirik's enemy, despite the name hobbling forward with the authority of his 70 winters. As the village's oldest resident, his opinions carried special weight in matters of tradition and precedent. "Freya Bjorn's daughter has held her land for 3 years without asking help from any man," old Magnus continued. "She's paid her taxes, honored her contracts, and helped her neighbors when they needed it. Now she asks us to do the same for her." "The situations are hardly comparable," Hakon protested. "Aren't they? She could have married any of a dozen men and let them handle this problem. Instead, she's asking us to stand with her as equals, to face danger as a community rather than leaving her to face it alone. The old man's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile. Seems to me that's the kind of neighbor worth having. The murmur that followed carried a different tone than before, less fearful, more thoughtful. Freya sensed the mood shifting, but she wasn't certain in which direction. Gunnar called for formal discussion among the council members. For nearly an hour, they debated in voices too low for the observers to follow, while Freya stood waiting and the sun climbed higher in the autumn sky. Finally, Gunnar rose and faced the gathering. "The council has reached a decision," he announced. "We will not compel Freyaborn's daughter to abandon her worker. However, we also cannot commit the village's resources to defending decisions made without our consultation." Freya felt her heart sink. It was a compromise that left her isolated while allowing the council to avoid taking a firm position. But Gunnar wasn't finished. "Therefore, we call upon those households who wish to offer voluntary assistance to make their own choices. The council will not forbid cooperation, but neither will we command it." The response was immediate. Old Magnus stepped forward first, followed by Bjorn Eriksson and 3 other young men. Astrid surprised everyone by joining them, along with 2 other women whose husbands had died in recent years. Within minutes, nearly a third of the village had declared their willingness to stand with Freya. Hakon's face grew thunderous as he watched his political maneuvering slip away. "You're making a mistake," he called out to the volunteers. "When blood flows, remember that you chose this path." "We chose to stand with our neighbor," old Magnus replied calmly, "just as our fathers did, and their fathers before them." As the gathering broke up, Freya found herself surrounded by people offering various forms of assistance: weapons, supplies, strategic advice, additional hands for preparation. The isolation she had feared transformed into something she had never expected. A community choosing to defend one of its own, not because they were commanded to, but because they believed it was right. Walking home with a dozen volunteers, Freya realized that Eirik had given her more than just protection and partnership. He had given her the opportunity to discover who her true friends were, and the chance to build alliances based on mutual respect rather than obligation or fear. That evening, as they planned defenses with their new allies, she began to understand that whatever came next, they would face it not as 2 people alone against the world, but as part of something larger, a community that had chosen to stand together against those who would take what didn't belong to them. The blood oath stone had been ancient when Eirik's grandfather was young, its carved runes weathered, but still legible to those who knew the old ways of writing. Hidden in the forest where he had once concealed his broken shield, it represented the most dangerous secret he carried, more dangerous even than his knowledge of Magnus's treachery. Now, as Magnus's ships appeared on the horizon like dark birds against the morning sky, Eirik knew the time for secrets had ended. 3 ships. As reported, he said to Freya as they watched from their carefully concealed observation post. "But smaller crews than I expected. Magnus is confident. Should that comfort us? It means he doesn't expect significant resistance. That gives us advantages he won't anticipate." Below them, the village showed signs of the preparations they had spent days coordinating. To casual observation, it appeared normal fishermen mending nets, women hanging laundry, children playing in the streets. But Freya could see the subtle indicators that revealed the truth. Men positioned near concealed weapon caches, women whose laundry lines provided communication signals, children whose games kept them close to predetermined safe positions. Ships anchored in the harbor with the casual arrogance of men accustomed to being feared. Magnus himself was visible on the lead vessel's deck, taller than most of his men, with the distinctive red hair that had earned their clan its name. Even at distance, his presence radiated the confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged. "He's aged," Eirik observed quietly. "You can see that from here?" "I can see how he holds himself." The Magnus I knew moved like a man who had time for anything. This one moves like someone with limited patience. As they watched, a smaller boat detached from the fleet and made for shore. Magnus stood in its bow, flanked by 4 warriors whose size and bearing marked them as elite fighters. They moved with the coordinated precision of men who had worked together for years. "The terms will be simple," Eirik continued. "He'll demand that I be turned over to him. He'll promise to leave peacefully if his demands are met. He'll threaten terrible consequences if they're refused. And then we discover whether our preparations were sufficient and whether our allies will stand when tested." They made their way back to the village by paths Eirik had scouted and improved over the past weeks. Every route had been planned to provide concealment and multiple options for retreat or reinforcement. Every position had been chosen to maximize their advantages while minimizing Magnus's dot. By the time they reached the main square, Magnus and his men were already there, having been escorted by Thane Hakon with a ceremony that stopped just short of welcome. The contrast between the two groups could not have been more stark. Hakon and his people nervous but trying to project authority. Magnus and his warriors relaxed and confident in their superiority. Elder Gunnar sat on the council stone, his formal robes lending dignity to what everyone understood might be his final official act. The other council members flanked him, while the villagers gathered in careful arrangements that appeared casual, but placed the strongest fighters in positions where they could respond quickly to trouble. "Magnus Bloodaxe," Gunnar began, using the formal address the protocol demanded. "You honor our village with your presence. How may we serve you?" Magnus smiled, and Freya felt a chill at the predatory satisfaction in his expression. "You have something that belongs to me, old man. I've come to collect it. We have many things that might interest a man of your stature. Perhaps you could be more specific." "My brother, Eirik Magnusson, though he may have given you a different name." Magnus's gaze swept the crowd until it found its target. "There he is, still hiding behind other people's hospitality." The crowd stirred as Magnus pointed directly at Eirik, but no one moved to seize him. This small act of defiance seemed to surprise Magnus, who had clearly expected immediate compliance. "Eirik is under our protection," Gunnar said carefully. "If you have grievances against him, they must be presented according to proper forms." Magnus laughed a sound like breaking glass. "Proper forms? He's a kinslayer and a traitor. The only proper form for dealing with such men is a sword across the throat." "That's a serious accusation," Elder Gunnar replied. "Do you have evidence to support it?" "I have the testimony of honorable men and the judgment of our clan council." "The testimony of men you suborned and the judgment of a council you controlled," Eirik said, stepping forward from the crowd. "Tell them the truth, Magnus. Tell them why you want me dead." "Because you betrayed our people to their enemies. Because I discovered you were selling information to the highest bidder. Because I learned that the ambush at Raven's Creek wasn't bad luck. It was a trap you arranged." Eirik's voice carried clearly across the square. "Because I found proof that you and Thorvald were getting rich while good men died in battles you had sabotaged from the beginning." Magnus's confident expression flickered. Lies from a desperate man. "Then, why are you here with armed warriors instead of magistrates? Why demand immediate surrender instead of formal extradition?" Eirik moved closer, and Freya could see the careful way he positioned himself. Close enough to strike, far enough to avoid being overwhelmed. "Because you know that any honest investigation would reveal the truth. The truth is that you're a traitor who has filled these people's heads with fantasies." Magnus gestured dismissively at the watching villagers. "But lies won't protect you forever." From his position near the well, old Magnus spoke up. "What proof do you offer for these accusations?" Magnus's warrior, a scarred man with predatory eyes, stepped forward. "Our word should be sufficient for farmers and fishermen." "Should it?" asked Astrid, moving to stand beside old Magnus. "We've heard your accusations, but we've also lived beside this man for months. We've seen his character and his actions. What have we seen from you? You've seen what happens to those who harbor enemies of Clan Bloodaxe," Magnus said, his patience clearly wearing thin dot. It was the wrong thing to say. Freya could feel the mood of the crowd shift as people recognized the threat for what it was. Not justice, but intimidation. "Actually," Eirik said quietly, "you've seen something else. You've seen the rightful heir to Clan Bloodaxe reduced to begging for work on a stranger's farm." The words fell into the square like stones into still water. Magnus went very still, his confidence replaced by something sharper and more dangerous. "What did you say?" Eirik reached into his shirt and withdrew a small stone carved with intricate runes. "The blood oath stone of Clan Ironforge, my mother's people. The people you thought were all dead." He held the stone high enough for everyone to see. "I am Eirik Magnusson by my father's line, but I am also Eirik Ironforge by my mother's blood. And Clan Ironforge has prior claim to the territories you've been ruling in their absence." Magnus's face went pale. "That's impossible. We killed them all." "You killed the men you could find. You missed the women who had married out, and you missed their children." Eirik's smile was cold as winter ice. "My mother never told me about my Ironforge heritage because she thought it safer to let that bloodline die. But when I went into exile, I sought out the truth about who I really was." "It doesn't matter," Magnus said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Dead bloodlines don't threaten living ones. They do when the survivors can prove that everything you've built was stolen from them. When they can demonstrate that your authority rests on lies and murder." Eirik took another step forward. "When they can offer these good people something you never could, legitimate leadership that doesn't depend on fear." The revelation transformed everything. What had begun as a simple extradition demand had become something far more complex. A challenge to Magnus's very right to rule, delivered in front of witnesses who could spread the word throughout the region. Magnus's hand moved to his sword hilt. "Lies and politics won't save you now, brother." "No," Eirik agreed, his own hand finding the hilt of the weapon at his side. "But truth might." The square fell silent as the two men faced each other, the weight of years of betrayal and bloodshed hanging between them like fog. Around them, the villagers watched with the terrible fascination of people who understood they were witnessing history being made. Magnus drew his sword in one smooth motion, the steel singing as it cleared the scabbard. "Then let truth be decided by strength, as it always has been." Eirik drew his own blade, and the morning sun caught its edge like fire. "For once, brother, we agree on something." Freya's mother's silver brooch had been crafted by Irish artisans 3 generations ago, its intricate Celtic knots representing the interconnection of all living things. Her grandmother had worn it to her wedding, her mother had worn it to hers, and Freya had worn it on the day she married Bjorn. Now, as she pinned it to Eirik's cloak in the gray light before dawn, she understood she was continuing a tradition while transforming its meaning entirely. "For luck?" Eirik asked, feeling the weight of the silver against his chest. "For love," Freya replied simply. "So, you remember what you're fighting for." Around them, the village prepared for war with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that survival depended on each person fulfilling their role perfectly. Children had been moved to the safest locations, weapons distributed according to skill and need, and final preparations completed on the defensive positions they had spent weeks preparing. Magnus's face darkened with rage, but before he could respond, Sigrid Ironforge spoke again. "Enough," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded respect for decades. "I have heard enough to understand what is happening here." She looked directly at Magnus. "You claim authority over lands that were stolen from my people through treachery and murder. You pursue a man whose only crime was discovering your corruption. You threaten innocent people who have done nothing but offer shelter to someone in need. These are internal clan matters that don't concern you, old woman. They concern me because this man carries Ironforge blood, which makes him my responsibility. They concern me because justice delayed is not justice denied. Sigurd's warriors moved closer, their weapons ready. And they concern me because I have spent 40 years gathering the strength to reclaim what was taken from us. The balance of power on the beach had shifted dramatically. Magnus found himself facing not just the village defenders, but a force of seasoned warriors led by someone with legitimate grievances against his rule. His men were beginning to understand that their simple mission had become something far more dangerous and complex. "What do you propose?" Magnus asked finally, his voice tight with controlled fury. "I propose that you withdraw your forces and return to whatever lands you can hold through honest means," Sigurd replied. "I propose that you end this pursuit of my kinsmen and allow these people to live in peace. And I propose that you consider whether your time might be better spent preparing for the reckoning that will eventually come for all your stolen gains. And if I refuse?" Eirik stepped forward before Sigurd could answer. "Then you'll discover what happens when people who have nothing left to lose decide they're tired of being afraid." The words carried across the water with the weight of prophecy. Magnus looked around at the forces arrayed against him. The village defenders who had chosen courage over safety, the Ironforge exiles who had waited decades for this moment, and at the center of it all, the brother he had tried to destroy who had somehow found the strength to stand against him. For the first time since arriving at this remote village, Magnus seemed to truly understand what he was facing. This wasn't just about capturing a fugitive or asserting his authority. This was about fundamental questions of right and wrong, of justice and power, of what kind of world they were all going to live in. "This isn't over," he said finally, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "No," Eirik agreed quietly. "It's just beginning. But for the first time in years, I'm not running from what comes next." As Magnus's forces began their withdrawal to the ships, the morning sun climbed higher over the harbor, burning away the last of the mist and revealing clearly the choice that had been made. A small village had stood against overwhelming force and discovered allies they never expected. An exile had found not just sanctuary, but a cause worth fighting for. And somewhere in the collision of old grievances and new possibilities, the seeds of a different future had been planted. The real test would be whether those seeds could grow into something strong enough to survive what was coming next. As face went pale with rage and disbelief. "You think these farmers and fishermen can protect you from the truth? You think their loyalty means anything when real power arrives?" "I think their loyalty means everything," Eirik replied, "because it's freely given, not bought or coerced." The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their confrontation. Through the smoke and chaos of the ongoing battle, more villagers appeared, not just the fighters who had committed to the defense, but others who had remained neutral until this moment. Elder Gunnar's wife, carrying her late husband's sword, the miller and his sons, armed with tools that could serve as weapons. Even some of Hakon's supporters, their faces grim but determined. "What is this?" Magnus demanded, his confidence shaking as he realized the scope of opposition forming against him. "This is what happens when people decide they've had enough of being ruled by fear," Freya answered, raising her father's axe. "This is what happens when a community chooses to stand together." Magnus looked around at the growing circle of defenders, his tactical mind calculating odds that were shifting rapidly against him. His professional warriors still held advantages in training and equipment, but they were now outnumbered by people fighting for their homes, their families, their right to choose their own future. "You're making a terrible mistake," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "I offered you mercy. I offered you a peaceful solution. You offered us submission, old Magnus corrected, stepping forward with his battle axe ready. There's a difference. The standoff stretched across several heartbeats, the morning air thick with tension and the smoke from burning barricades. Then Magnus made his choice, not the frontal assault his pride demanded, but the calculated retreat his experience suggested. This isn't over, he called out as he signaled his men to withdraw. I'll return with more ships, more men. You can't fight the natural order forever. We're not fighting the natural order, Eirik replied. We're building a better one. As Magnus's forces pulled back toward their ships, the villagers maintained their defensive positions, watching warily until the vessels disappeared beyond the horizon. Only then did they begin to lower their weapons and assess what they had accomplished. They had done more than survive Magnus's threat. They had discovered something about themselves and their community that would change everything that came after. They had learned that when people who respect each other choose to stand together, they become something greater than the sum of their individual strengths. Standing in the square where it all began, surrounded by neighbors who had become allies, and allies who had become family, Freya realized that their victory was not just tactical, but transformational. They had proven that there were alternatives to the old patterns of domination and submission, that communities could choose cooperation over conquest, that the future stretched ahead of them, uncertain but full of possibility. Whatever challenges came next, they would face them together with the quiet confidence that came from knowing they had built something worth defending, and that they had the strength to defend it. As Han moved to his sword hilt, the diplomatic pretense finally abandoned. Bonds can be broken when they become chains, brother. I learned that lesson. You never did. No, I learned a different lesson. I learned that some things are worth dying for. Then, today, you'll have the chance to prove it. The formal negotiations were over. As they walked back toward the village, Elder Gunnar moved with the careful dignity of a man who knew he might be walking to his death, but refused to show fear. He never intended to honor any agreement, Gunnar observed. No, this was about demonstrating his power and our helplessness. He wanted witnesses to our submission. Eirik glanced back toward the ships. When we refused to submit, we made this a test of strength rather than a negotiation. Are you ready for that test? Eirik touched the silver brooch at his chest, feeling its weight like a talisman. I'm ready to discover what I'm truly capable of when I have something worth protecting. As they reached the village outskirts, the horn sounded again. 3 long blasts that meant the time for talk had ended. Behind them, Magnus's ships began moving toward shore, their crews shouting orders and preparing weapons. The battle for everything they had built was about to begin. Freya met them at the first defensive position, her father's axe in her hands, and determination written across her features. Around her, the people who had chosen to stand together prepared to discover whether their courage would be sufficient to preserve the life they had chosen to defend. Positions, Eirik called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone born to command. Remember what we planned. Trust each other, and make them pay dearly for every step. As the villagers moved to their assigned positions, Freya caught Eirik's hand one final time. Together? She asked. Together, he confirmed. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and revealing Magnus's forces as they formed up on the beach. 3 ships' worth of professional warriors, armed and armored, facing a collection of farmers, fishermen, and craftspeople who had chosen to fight rather than surrender. But as Freya watched the enemy formation advance up the harbor road, she noticed something that gave her hope. These men moved with discipline, yes, but also with the mechanical precision of soldiers following orders they didn't necessarily believe in. They were here because Magnus commanded it, not because they shared his personal vendetta against Eirik. Look at their faces, she murmured to Elder Gunnar. They're not eager for this fight. Gunnar squinted at the approaching force. professional soldiers rarely are. They know the cost of battle better than those who romanticize it. This observation sparked an idea that had been forming in the back of Freya's mind since the failed negotiations. Magnus needed this confrontation to be personal, a matter of honor and family betrayal that justified his pursuit of Eirik across dangerous waters. But his men needed it to be practical, a mission that served their interests rather than simply satisfying their leader's wounded pride. "What if we give them a reason to reconsider their loyalty?" she asked. "What do you mean?" Magnus's authority over those men depends on their belief that following him serves their best interests. But what if we could demonstrate that their true interests lie elsewhere? Before Gunnar could respond, the sound of horns echoed across the water, not from Magnus's ships, but from the open sea beyond. Through the morning haze, new sails appeared on the horizon, approaching fast with the wind at their backs. Eirik's eyes narrowed as he studied the newcomers. "Those are Magnus's reinforcements. Wrong colors, wrong formation." His voice carried a note of recognition. "Those are Ironforge banners." "Impossible," Elder Gunnar breathed. "Clan Ironforge was destroyed decades ago." "The main branch was," Eirik corrected. "But families scatter when their homelands are threatened. Some went into exile, some married into other clans, some simply disappeared into the wider world." He smiled grimly. "It seems word of my heritage has reached ears I didn't expect." The approaching ships moved with the purposeful speed of a force that had traveled far to arrive at this specific moment. As they drew closer, details became visible, weather-beaten hulls that spoke of long voyages, crews that moved with the easy coordination of experienced sailors, and at the prow of the lead vessel, Hull, a figure whose bearing suggested command authority. Magnus's advance had stopped as his men noticed the new arrivals. Professional soldiers understood the mathematics of battle, and the addition of unknown forces to an already complex situation required careful reassessment of risks and benefits. "This changes everything," Freya observed. "Does it?" Eirik asked. "Those ships might be coming to help Magnus destroy the last of the Ironforge bloodline. They might see me as a pretender who needs to be eliminated before I can make claims that threaten their own positions. Or they might see you as the legitimate heir they've been hoping would someday return to restore what was taken from them." The uncertainty hung between them like fog, transforming what had seemed like a desperate last stand into something far more complex. The battle they had prepared for, a small community defending itself against overwhelming force, had become a convergence of old grievances, ancient claims, and competing visions of what the future should look like. As the Ironforge ships entered the harbor and began deploying their own forces, Magnus's carefully planned assault dissolved into confusion. His men found themselves facing not just the village's defenses, but the possibility of a three-way conflict, whose outcome no one could predict. The morning that had begun with the certainty of violence now trembled on the edge of something unprecedented, a moment when the old patterns of conquest and submission might give way to negotiations that could reshape the entire region's understanding of power and authority. Standing at the center of forces that represented the past, present, and potential future, Freya realized that their small act of defiance had become something much larger. They were no longer just fighting for their right to choose their own path. They were participating in a transformation that could echo through generations. The question was no longer whether they could survive Magnus's attack, but whether they could help shape whatever emerged from the collision of all these competing interests. The battle for their village had become a battle for the future itself, and the outcome would determine not just their own fate, but the fate of everyone who dreamed of building something better than what had come before. Had given them until noon to consider his demands, a gesture that appeared generous, but was actually calculated to increase their anxiety. He knew that waiting was often more destructive to morale than immediate action. The people's resolve could weaken when they had time to contemplate the consequences of defiance. But Magnus had misunderstood the community he was threatening. These were people accustomed to facing uncertain harvests, dangerous seas, and harsh winters together. They had learned that survival often required supporting each other through difficulties that no individual could handle alone. "The archers will take position on the rooftops at the signal," old Magnus reported, his weathered hand steady as he checked his bowstring one final time. "Astrid and the other women have prepared the fire arrows and oil pots." Young Bjorn nodded. "Toward the harbor road. We've prepared 3 fallback positions if they break through the first line. Each one is designed to channel them into killing zones." "And if they try to circle around through the forest?" Freya asked. "Eirik and I will be watching the northern approaches," volunteered Olaf the Hunter, a quiet man whose intimate knowledge of local terrain made him invaluable. "They won't surprise us from that direction." As the final preparations continued, Freya found herself moving through the village with a strange sense of displacement. These familiar streets and buildings had become a battlefield. These neighbors she had known since childhood had become soldiers preparing for combat. The transformation felt both surreal and inevitable. "You're thinking too much," Eirik observed, joining her near the well that served as their communication center. "I'm thinking about consequences. About what happens to these people if we lose. Then we don't lose. It's not that simple." Eirik was quiet for a moment, his gaze following the morning light as it painted the harbor in shades of gold and silver. "No, it's not. But sometimes survival requires reducing complex problems to simple choices. Today, we choose to stand rather than kneel. And if standing gets people killed, then we honor their sacrifice by making sure it wasn't meaningless." He turned to face her fully. "Freya, these people didn't choose to stand with us because they thought it would be easy or safe. They chose because they believe some things are worth fighting for." Before she could respond, a horn sounded from the harbor, not the harsh battle call she had expected, but the formal announcement that preceded diplomatic communication. Through the morning mist, they could see a small boat approaching shore, carrying what appeared to be a single figure under a banner of truce. "Magnus wants to talk again," Eirik said, but his tone suggested suspicion rather than relief. The messenger proved to be one of Magnus's warriors, not one of his inner circle, but a professional soldier carrying out orders. He delivered his message with military precision. Magnus would meet with the village leaders at the harbor beach to discuss terms. No weapons, no guards beyond a single companion each. "It's a trap," young Bjorn said immediately. "Of course it's a trap," Eirik agreed. "The question is what kind." Elder Gunnar, despite his age, insisted on serving as the village's representative. Eirik would accompany him as the person Magnus had specifically come to claim. The arrangement satisfied no one completely, but it followed the forms that tradition demanded. As they prepared to leave for the meeting, Freya caught Eirik's arm. "If this goes badly, it will go badly. Magnus didn't come here to negotiate in good faith." Eirik covered her hand with his own. "But sometimes you have to let your enemy make the first move to understand what kind of fight you're really in. And if you don't come back, then you make sure Magnus regrets it." The walk to the beach felt like a journey through memory. This was the same path Freya had walked countless times to see Bjorn's ship return from trading voyages. The same stretch of sand where she had played as a child. The same harbor that had provided safety and prosperity for her community for generations. Now, it might become the place where everything changed. Magnus waited at the water's edge, his red hair brilliant in the morning sun. He had brought only one companion as promised, but Freya could see his ships anchored nearby, their crews clearly visible and ready for action. The message was obvious, was observing the forms, but he was also prepared to abandon them at any moment. "Elder," Magnus said, nodding respectfully to Gunnar, "I appreciate your willingness to hear reason. I appreciate your willingness to observe proper protocols, Gunnar replied. What terms do you offer? Simple ones. You turn over the trigger, and I withdraw peacefully. No harm comes to your village. Your people continue their lives without interference, and this unfortunate situation ends without bloodshed. And if we refuse? Magnus's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Then you discover why Clan Bloodaxe has ruled the northern territories for 3 generations. I see. Gunnar's voice remained steady despite the implied threat. And what assurance do we have that you'll honor your word? My oath as a clan leader. The same oath you swore to your brother before you tried to have him killed. The question hit Magnus like a physical blow. For a moment, his diplomatic mask slipped, revealing the rage beneath. You know nothing about the complexities of leadership, old man. Sometimes hard choices must be made for the greater good, including the choice to betray your own blood, including the choice to eliminate those who threaten the stability of everything we've built. Magnus stepped closer to Eirik. My brother was always too idealistic, too concerned with abstract notions of honor to understand practical realities. That idealism made him dangerous. More dangerous than corruption and betrayal? More dangerous than effective leadership. Magnus's voice hardened. I offered him chances to adapt, to understand that ruling requires compromises. He chose to make himself an enemy instead. Eirik had remained silent throughout the exchange, but now he spoke with quiet intensity. You offered me chances to become complicit in murder and theft. When I refused, you decided I was too dangerous to live. Because you were. You still are. Yes, Eirik agreed. I am dangerous to men who believe power gives them the right to take whatever they want. I'm dangerous to leaders who think their people exist to serve them rather than the other way around. He paused, letting his words carry across the water toward Magnus's ships. And I'm especially dangerous to brothers who forget that some bonds are supposed to be unbreakable. The flame of the hearth had burned continuously in Freya's cottage for 3 years, fed each morning and banked each night according to the traditions her grandmother had taught her. A home's fire should never die, the old women said, because it represented the life and warmth that made a house more than mere shelter. Now, as Magnus's warriors advanced up the harbor road in disciplined formation, that flame became the symbol of everything they were fighting to protect. The first arrows came from the rooftops as planned, a carefully coordinated volley that struck the leading ranks of Magnus's force. The professional warriors responded with the smooth efficiency of men who had faced archery before, raising shields and adjusting their formation without breaking stride. But the village archers had expected this. Their real purpose wasn't to stop the advance, but to force the attackers into the killing ground that had been prepared for them. Now, Eirik called out from his position behind the earthwork barriers. The first of Astrid's fire arrows struck the oil-soaked barricades that had been placed across the main approach route. Flames roared to life, creating a wall of fire that channeled Magnus's warriors toward the narrow passages where the defenders waited dot from her position near the well. Freya watched the battle unfold with the calculating eye she had learned from years of managing resources and planning for contingencies. The village's strategy was working. Magnus's superior numbers meant nothing if he could only bring a few men to bear at once against prepared defensive positions. But she could also see what Eirik had warned her about. These were professional soldiers who adapted quickly to changing circumstances. Already, Magnus was dividing his force, sending groups to probe for alternate routes while maintaining pressure on the main defensive line. Second wave coming from the north, called Olaf from his forest position. Dozen men, moving carefully. This was the test they had all dreaded. If Magnus could establish a foothold behind their primary defenses, the careful coordination they depended on would collapse into chaos. Bjorn, take your men and reinforce the northern approach, Eirik ordered. Hold them long enough for us to finish here. Young Bjorn nodded and led half a dozen fighters toward the threatened sector, leaving the main position undermanned but not abandoned. It was the kind of calculated risk that could save them or doom them, depending on how quickly they could. Resolve the primary engagement. The answer came sooner than expected. Magnus himself appeared at the head of his assault force, his red hair unmistakable even through the smoke and confusion. He moved with the controlled fury of a man who had realized his easy victory was becoming something much more costly. "Eirik!" His voice carried across the battlefield like thunder. "End this. Face me yourself and let these people live." It was the challenge they had both known was coming, the personal confrontation that had been inevitable since the moment Eirik revealed his true heritage. But accepting it meant abandoning the defensive positions that gave the villagers their only real advantage. "Don't," Freya called out, reading his intention in the way he gripped his weapon. "It's what he wants to reduce this to single combat, where his skills give him the edge. If I don't, he'll keep sending men until we're overwhelmed. Better to end it now. Together," she reminded him. "We decided to face everything together." Eirik's smile was fierce and proud. "Then come with me. Let's show him what he's really fighting." They moved forward together, abandoning the safety of their prepared positions to meet Magnus in the open ground before the burning barricades. Around them, the battle continued, but the focus had shifted to this central confrontation, the rightful heir facing the usurper, the betrayed brother confronting the betrayer. Magnus advanced with two of his best warriors flanking him, their coordination speaking of years of fighting together. But as they closed the distance, something unexpected happened. Old Magnus and Astrid emerged from cover to stand beside Freya and Eirik, their weapons ready despite the impossible odds. "This is madness," Magnus Bloodaxe called out. 4 villagers against 3 proven warriors? I'm offering you an honorable death. Don't force me to give you a meaningless one. There's nothing meaningless about standing with people you care about, old Magnus replied, his weathered hand steady on his battle axe. Nothing meaningless about defending your home, Astrid added, hefting the sword she had claimed from her late husband's effects. Magnus's expression twisted with contempt. Sentiment. This is why you were always weak, brother. You let emotions cloud your judgment. No, Eirik replied, shifting into the combat stance that had once made him feared throughout the northern territories. This is why I was always stronger than you realized. Because I fought for something beyond myself. The clash, when it came, was brutal and immediate. Magnus struck with the overwhelming force of a man accustomed to ending fights quickly, his sword moving in patterns that spoke of decades of training and experience. But Eirik met him with equal skill, their blades ringing against each other in a deadly dance that neither could afford to lose. Around them, the secondary combats unfolded with desperate intensity. Old Magnus faced one of the warriors with the cunning of age against the strength of youth, using terrain and experience to offset his opponent's physical advantages. Astrid found herself matched against a scarred veteran who had clearly never expected to fight a baker's wife, but who adapted quickly to the reality that she knew how to use the blade in her hands. But it was Freya who surprised everyone, including herself. When Magnus's second warrior moved to flank Eirik during a particularly intense exchange, she intercepted him with her father's axe, fighting with a fury born of protecting everything she had built from those who would take it from her. The battle became a swirling melee of individual combats that constantly shifted and merged. Magnus pressed his advantage against Eirik, forcing him back toward the burning barricades where a heat and smoke would limit his movement. But Eirik had anticipated this, drawing his enemy into position for a counterattack that had been planned from the beginning. As Magnus raised his sword for what he clearly intended to be the killing blow, Eirik dropped low and swept his legs, sending the larger man crashing to the ground. In the same motion, He rolled aside and came up with his blade at Magnus's throat. "Yield," he commanded. Magnus's eyes burned with hatred and disbelief. "Kill me then, brother. Prove you have the strength to rule." "Ruling isn't about killing," Eirik replied. "It's about knowing when to show mercy. Mercy is weakness. Mercy is choice." Something you never understood. For a moment, the battle hung suspended as everyone waited to see what Eirik would decide. Then, slowly, he stepped back and lowered his sword. "I choose to let you live," he said, "but not here. Take your ships and go. Never return to these waters, and never threaten these people again." Magnus struggled to his feet, his face a mask of humiliation and rage. "This isn't over." "Yes," Eirik said quietly. "It is. Because I'm no longer running, and you're no longer hunting someone who fights alone." Around them, the remaining members of Magnus's force had laid down their weapons, recognizing that their leader's defeat meant the end of their mission. The village had held, not through superior force, but through the determination of people who refused to surrender what they had built together. Magnus's warhammer had been forged by the finest smiths in the northern territories, its head inscribed, with runes that spoke of victories in a dozen campaigns. It was a weapon that represented everything Magnus believed about power, that strength was the only currency that mattered, that the strong had the right to take whatever they wanted from the weak. That fear was the foundation of all lasting authority. Now it lay shattered in the mud of Freya's farmyard, its handle split and its head cracked beyond repair. The breaking had come at the moment when Magnus, despite his defeat, had attempted one final act of treachery. As Eirik turned away from their confrontation, offering the mercy he believed his brother deserved, Magnus had reached for a concealed knife, aiming for the gap between Eirik's shoulder blades where armor couldn't protect him. Freya had seen the movement and reacted with the instincts of someone who had learned that survival sometimes required violence. Her father's axe met Magnus's hammer in a collision that sent shock waves through both weapons and both warriors. But where her axe had been forged with love and maintained with care, his hammer had been created for destruction alone. Metal screamed against metal, and Magnus's prized weapon broke apart like a symbol of everything wrong with his approach to leadership. "You had your chance," Freya said, standing over him with her axe still ready. "He offered you mercy, and you chose betrayal again." Magnus stared at the runes in his weapon with the expression of a man watching his entire worldview collapse. "You don't understand what you've done. Without strong leadership, without the fear that keeps ambitious men in line, everything will fall apart." "Then we'll build something better," Eirik replied, helping his enemy to his feet with careful courtesy. "Something based on cooperation instead of domination. Naive idealism. It won't last." "Maybe not, but it's worth trying." As Magnus's surviving warriors gathered their wounded and prepared to withdraw, the villagers began to assess the cost of their victory. 3 men had died in the fighting, and several others bore wounds that would mark them for the rest of their lives. The price of freedom, they discovered, was always higher than the price of submission, but it was a cost they had chosen to pay together. Elder Gunnar approached Eirik as the enemy ships prepared to depart. "The village council meets to discuss what comes next. You've proven your right to be here, but questions remain about your future role in our community." "I understand. Do you? Because what I'm really asking is whether you intend to claim the leadership that your heritage might entitle you to." It was the question everyone had been thinking, but no one had been willing to voice directly. Eirik's revelation about his iron forge bloodline had changed everything, not just his legal status, but the entire balance of power in the region. As the rightful heir to territories that Magnus had been ruling, he could theoretically claim authority over not just this village, but dozens of others. The old patterns of thinking suggested that having won his battle, Eirik would naturally assume the leadership role that victory had earned him. But the old patterns had led to the corruption and betrayal that had brought Magnus to their shores in the first place. "I have no interest in ruling anyone," Eirik said finally. "I've seen what the pursuit of power does to men, and I want no part of it." "Then what do you want?" Eirik looked around at the village that had chosen to stand with him, at the people who had risked everything to defend a principle rather than submitting to convenience. His gaze lingered on Freya, who stood quietly beside him with the patient strength that had first drawn him to her doorstep. "I want to build something with the woman I love. I want to contribute to a community that values cooperation over dominance. I want to prove that there are better ways to live than the ones I was raised to believe were inevitable." "And your claim to the Ironforge territories?" "I renounce it. Let the people who live there choose their own leaders." Eirik paused, considering the implications of his decision. "But I reserve the right to protect them if someone else tries to claim authority over them by force." Gunnar nodded slowly. "A guardian rather than a ruler. A neighbor willing to help when help is needed." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the harbor. Magnus's ships were departing as promised, but something about their movement suggested urgency rather than orderly withdrawal. Through the morning mist came the sound of more horns, not the harsh calls of warfare, but the deeper, more resonant tones that announced the arrival of official delegations. "More visitors," young Bjorn observed, shading his eyes against the sun. "These are different," Eirik said, studying the approaching vessels. "Those are royal colors." The ships that entered the harbor flew the banners of the High King's court, and their crews moved with the formal precision of men on official business rather than military campaign. As they anchored and prepared to send delegates ashore, it became clear that news of the morning's events had traveled faster than anyone had expected. The delegation that came ashore was led by Jarl Thorstein, a man whose reputation for fairness had made him one of the High King's most trusted representatives. He was accompanied by scribes, guards, and officials whose presence suggested that this was more than a simple fact-finding mission. "Eirik Magnusson," Thorstein called out as he approached the group of villagers, "also known as Eirik Ironforge." "I believe just Eirik will suffice," he replied. "The High King has received word of recent events in these waters. Reports of clan warfare, disputed successions, and competing claims to territory that falls under royal jurisdiction." Thorstein's gaze swept the battlefield, taking in the evidence of recent fighting. "We've come to investigate these reports and determine what action, if any, the crown should take." "What have you heard?" "That Magnus Bloodaxe was attempting to eliminate a rival claimant to prevent challenges to his authority. That this village chose to shelter said claimant and fought to defend him against illegal aggression. That the claimant has since revealed himself to be the rightful heir to territories that were seized through violence decades ago." The summary was accurate as far as it went, but Freya could see the trap inherent in the official perspective. The High King's court thought in terms of territorial claims and succession, disputes, the traditional framework that had led to endless cycles of violence and betrayal. "The reports are mostly accurate," Eirik said carefully, "but incomplete." "In what way?" "They assume that proving my heritage means I want to claim the authority that goes with it. They assume that winning a battle means I want to rule the territories my mother's people once held." Eirik stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "I want neither." Thorstein's eyebrows rose. "You're renouncing your claim?" "I'm rejecting the entire system that makes such claims necessary. I want to help build something better, communities that choose their own. Leaders, alliances based on mutual benefit rather than conquest. Protection that comes from cooperation rather than domination. Idealistic, but impractical in the real world. Is it? Look around you." Eirik gestured toward the villagers who had fought beside him. "These people didn't follow me because I claimed authority over them. They stood with me because they believed in the principles I represented. They fought not to make me their ruler, but to preserve their right to choose their own path. Thorstein studied the faces of the assembled villagers, noting the determination and pride that marked people who had discovered their own strength. And you believe this model can work on a larger scale? I believe it's worth trying. And I believe there are people throughout these territories who are tired of being ruled by men, who see them as resources to be exploited rather than communities to be served. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Thorstein questioning villagers about their experiences and motivations, documenting their perspective on the events that had brought royal attention to their remote settlement. But the real decision had been made in those first few moments. When Eirik had chosen to reject the power that victory might have given him as the official delegation prepared to depart, Thorstein approached Eirik one final time. The High King will be interested in your experiment, he said. If you succeed in building the kind of communities you describe, it could change how we think about governance throughout the realm. And if we fail, then at least you'll have failed trying to build something better rather than perpetuating something that was already broken. As the royal ships departed, carrying their report back to distant courts and councils, Freya realized that their small victory had become something larger, a symbol of possibility that would be watched, discussed, and either emulated or dismissed, based on what they managed to build in the years ahead. The responsibility was daunting, but as she stood beside Eirik, watching the sun set over their battle-scarred but undefeated village, she felt ready to face whatever challenges that responsibility might bring. The new wedding rings had been forged by old Magnus in the quiet days following the battle, their design simple but profound in its symbolism. He had taken iron from Freya's original wedding band, the one she had worn for 3 years as a widow, the one that had connected her to a past she honored but could not live in forever. To this, he had added metal from Eirik's broken shield, the one that had borne the marks of his former clan and represented the identity he had been forced to abandon, melted together in the forged fire that had shaped tools for the village for 40 years. The metals had lost their individual histories and become something new rings that spoke not of conquest or submission, but of two people choosing to build a future from the materials of their shared past. The wedding ceremony took place on a crisp morning in early spring, with the entire village gathered in the square where they had once faced Magnus's ultimatum. The contrast could not have been more complete. Where there had been fear and division, there was now celebration and unity. Where there had been threats of violence, there was now the quiet joy of a community witnessing the formal beginning of a partnership they had already seen tested under the harshest possible circumstances. Elder Gunnar performed the ceremony with the gravity due to an occasion that represented more than just the union of two individuals. This was the culmination of a transformation that had touched everyone present. The moment when their small community formally acknowledged that they had chosen a different path from the traditional cycles of domination and submission that had governed their world for generations. Do you, Freya-born's daughter, take this man as your partner in all things, in prosperity and hardship, in peace and conflict, in the daily work of building a life together? I do, she replied, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. But her eyes remained fixed on Eirik's face, and her words were meant for him alone. I choose you, not because I need protection, but because I want a true partner. I choose to build something with you that neither of us could create alone. Do you, Eirik? Gunnar paused, recognizing the significance of the name he would use. Do you, Eirik of this village, take this woman as your partner in all things? I do, Eirik said, and his smile held the warmth of a man who had finally found his home. I choose you because you saw worth in me when I had nothing to offer but broken promises and dangerous enemies. I choose to stand beside you as an equal, to face whatever comes with someone who understands both independence and interdependence. As they exchanged rings, Freya felt the weight of the new band on her finger heavier than her first ring, but somehow more comfortable. This ring had been forged specifically for her hand, designed to fit the life she had chosen rather than the one that had been chosen for her. The celebration that followed reflected the character of the community that hosted it. There were no elaborate displays of wealth or power, no formal hierarchies dictating who could speak or where they could sit. Instead, there was the warm chaos of people who had learned to trust each other, sharing food, stories, and laughter in the aftermath of trials that had proven their bonds were stronger than the forces that had tried to break them. Old Magnus raised his cup during the toasts, his weathered face creased with satisfaction. To Freya and Eirik, who taught us that the strongest partnerships are built on choice rather than necessity, and that the best leaders are those who help others discover their own strength. Astrid followed with her own toast, to the lesson that standing together doesn't require anyone to stand alone, and that protecting what we love sometimes means fighting for it. As the formal celebration continued into the evening, Freya and Eirik found themselves drawn away from the crowd to the familiar quiet of their farm. The buildings bore scars from the recent battle repaired, but not forgotten. Reminders of the price they had paid for the freedom to choose their own path. Any regrets? Eirik asked as they stood together in the dooryard where he had first knelt, and asked for work. About which part? Hiring a desperate stranger? Standing against impossible odds? Marrying a man with more enemies than friends? Any of it. All of it. Freya considered the question seriously, looking around at the land that had become truly theirs through shared struggle rather than inherited right. The farm was larger now, expanded through the addition of plots from neighbors who had decided to consolidate their holdings for mutual protection. The defensive works had been maintained and improved, not because they expected more attacks, but because being prepared had become part of their identity. Most importantly, the isolation that had once defined her existence had been replaced by connections to Eirik, to their neighbors, to the broader network of communities that were experimenting with the same principles of cooperation and mutual support. No regrets, she said finally. But I do wonder what comes next. What do you mean? We've proven that our way can work here, with these people, under these circumstances. But the real test will be whether it can work elsewhere with different challenges and different people. It was a question that had occupied much of their thinking in recent weeks. Word of their successful resistance had spread throughout the region, carried by merchants, travelers, and the royal delegation that had investigated the aftermath of Magnus's defeat. Communities facing their own struggles with exploitative leaders had begun sending representatives to ask advice, to observe their methods, to request assistance in implementing similar approaches. The requests had forced them to think beyond their immediate concerns about managing a single farm or protecting a single village. They were being asked to help export their model, to serve as teachers and advisors to people who wanted to build something similar in their own circumstances. I've been thinking about that, Eirik said, about the difference between ruling and serving, between claiming authority and earning trust. And I think we need to be very careful about how we respond to these requests. The moment we start thinking of ourselves as the people who have all the answers, we become just another form of the problem we tried to solve. Freya nodded, understanding the trap he was describing. It would be easy to let success create its own form of arrogance, to begin believing that their specific solutions were universally applicable rather than locally developed responses to particular challenges. So, what do? We share what we've learned while helping others discover what works for them. We offer support without trying to control outcomes. We build networks instead of hierarchies. It was the kind of long-term thinking that had always attracted her to Eirik's ability to see beyond immediate problems to the larger patterns they represented. But it was also daunting in its implications, suggesting a future filled with responsibilities that neither of them had originally sought. "That sounds like it could become a lifetime's work," she observed. "Would that bother you?" Freya looked around at their farm one more time, noting the subtle changes that marked it as a place where important decisions had been made and significant events had unfolded. The cottage where she had spent 3 years learning to live alone, the barn where Eirik had slept while earning her trust, the well where village gossip had once threatened to destroy the relationship they were building, all of it had become part of their shared story. But it was still their starting point, not their destination. The life they were building together would require them to grow beyond the boundaries of what they had already accomplished, to take the principles they had discovered and help others apply them in circumstances they couldn't yet imagine. "No," she said finally, "it doesn't bother me, as long as we're building it together." As the sun set over their transformed village, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of the morning when Eirik had first appeared at her door, Freya realized that their story was ending exactly where it had begun, with two people choosing to trust each other enough to face an uncertain future together. The difference was that now they knew what they were capable of when they stood as wostednesses, partners rather than as individuals trying to survive alone. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would meet them the same way they had met everything else together, with the quiet strength that came from knowing they had found something worth defending in each other, and in the community they had helped to build. Behind them, the light from their cottage windows glowed warm against the gathering darkness, the flame of their hearth still burning steady and bright, a beacon of the home they had created and the future they had chosen to build, one careful decision at a time.